Chapter 57, Fathom being safely housed, the reader is entertained with a retrospect. But now it is high time to leave our adventurer to chew the cud of reflection and remorse in this solitary mansion, that we may trace Ronaldo in the several steps he took to assert his right, and do justice to his family. Never man indulged a more melancholy train of ideas than that which accompanied him in his journey to the imperial court. For, notwithstanding the manifold reasons he had to expect a happy issue to his aim, his imagination was incessantly infected with something that chilled his nerves and saddened his heart, recurring, with quick succession, like the unwearied wave that beats upon the bleak, inhospitable Greenland shore. This, the reader will easily suppose, was no other than the remembrance of the forlorn Monimia, whose image appeared to his fancy in different attitudes, according to the prevalence of the passions which raged in his bosom. Sometimes he viewed her in the light of apostasy, and then his soul was maddened with indignation and despair. But these transitory blasts were not able to efface the impressions she had formerly made upon his heart, impressions which he had so often and so long contemplated with inconceivable rapture. These pictures still remained, representing her fair as the most perfect idea of beauty, soft and tender as an angel of mercy and compassion, warmed with every virtue of the heart and adorned with every accomplishment of human nature. Yet the alarming contrast came still in the rear of this recollection, so that his soul was by turns agitated by the tempests of horror, and overwhelmed by the floods of grief. He recalled the moment on which he first beheld her, with that pleasing regret which attends the memory of a dear deceased friend. Then he bitterly cursed it, as the source of all his misfortunes and affliction. He thanked heaven for having blessed him with a friend to detect her perfidy and ingratitude, and then ardently wished he had still continued under the influence of her delusion. In a word, the loneliness of his situation aggravated every horror of his reflection, for, as he found himself without company, his imagination was never solicited, or his attention diverted from these subjects of woe, and he travelled to Brussels in a reverie, fraught with such torments as must have entirely wrecked his reason, had not Providence interposed in his behalf. He was, by his postilion, conducted to one of the best inns of the place, where he understood the cloth was already laid for supper, and as the ordinary is open to strangers in all these houses of entertainment, he introduced himself into the company, with a view to alleviate, in some measure, his sorrow and chagrin, by the conversation of his fellow guests. Yet he was so ill prepared to obtain the relief which he courted, that he entered the apartment, and sat down to table, without distinguishing either the number or countenances of those who were present, though he himself did not long remain so unregarded. His mien and deportment produced a prepossession in his favour, and the air of affliction, so remarkable in his visage, did not fail to attract their sympathy and observation. Among the rest, was an Irish officer in the Austrian service, who having eyed Ronaldo attentively, "Sir," said he, rising, "if my eyes and memory do not deceive me, you are the Count de Melville, with whom I had the honour to serve upon the Rhine during the last war." The youth, hearing his own name mentioned, lifted up his eyes, and at once recognizing the other to be a gentleman who had been a captain in his father's regiment, ran forwards, and embraced him with great affection. This was, in divers respects, a fortunate rencontre for young Melville, as the officer was not only perfectly well acquainted with the situation of the Count's family, but also resolved, in a few days, to set out for Vienna, whither he promised to accompany Ronaldo, as soon as he understood his route lay the same way. Before the day fixed for their departure arrived, this gentleman found means to insinuate himself so far into the confidence of the Count, as to learn the cause of that distress which he had observed in his features at their first meeting, and being a gentleman of uncommon vivacity, as well as sincerely attached to the family of Melville, to which he had owed his promotion, he exerted all his good humour and good sense in amusing the fancy, and reasoning down the mortification of the afflicted Hungarian. He in particular endeavoured to wean his attention from the lost Monimia, by engaging it upon his domestic affairs, and upon the wrongs of his mother and sister, who, he gave him to understand, were languishing under the tyranny of his father-in-law. This was a note that effectually roused him from the lethargy of his sorrow, and the desire of taking vengeance on the oppressor, who had ruined his fortune, and made his nearest relations miserable, so entirely engrossed his thoughts, as to leave no room for other considerations. During their journey to Austria, Major Farrell, that was the name of his fellow traveler, informed him of many circumstances touching his father's house, to which himself was an utter stranger. "The conduct of your mother," said he, "in marrying Count Tobias, was not at all agreeable either to the friends of the Count de Melville, or to her own relations, who knew her second husband to be a man of a violent temper and rapacious disposition, which the nature of his education and employment had served rather to inflame than allay, for you well know he was a partisan during the whole course of the late war." They were, moreover, equally surprised and chagrined, when they found she took no step to prevent his seizing upon that inheritance which of right belonged to you, and which, by the laws of Hungary, is unalienable from the heir of blood. Nevertheless, they are now fully convinced that she hath more than sufficiently atoned for her indiscretion, by the barbarity of her husband, who hath not only secluded her from all communication with her friends and acquaintance, but even confined her to the west tower of your father's house, where she is said to be kept close prisoner, and subjected to all sorts of inconvenience and mortification. This severity she is believed to have incurred in consequence of having expostulated to him upon his unjust behavior to you and Mademoiselle, whom he hath actually shut up in some convent in Vienna, which your relations have not as yet been able to discover. But the memory of your noble father is so dear to all those who were favored with his friendship, and the sufferings of the Countess and Mademoiselle have raised such a spirit of resentment against her cruel jailer, that nothing is wanted but your presence to begin the prosecution, and give a sanction to the measures of your friends, which will in a little time restore your family to the fruition of its rights and fortune. For my own part, my dear Count, I consider myself as one wholly indebted to your house for the rank and expectation I now enjoy, and my finances, interest, and person, such as they are, I dedicate to your service." Rinaldo was not slow in making his acknowledgments to this generous Hibernian, whom he informed of his scheme, recounting to him his uncommon transaction with the benevolent Jew, and communicating the letters of recommendation he had received by his means to some of the first noblemen at the imperial court. Meanwhile, he burned with impatience to chastise Count Tobias for his perfidious conduct to the widow and the fatherless, and would have taken the road to Pressburg, without touching at Vienna, in order to call him to a severe account, had not he been strenuously opposed by Major Farrell, who represented the imprudence of taking such a step before he had secured a proper protection from the consequences with which it might be attended. "It is not," said he, "your own life and fortune only which depend upon your behavior in this emergency, but also the quiet and happiness of those who are most dear to your affection. Not you alone, but likewise your mother and sister, would infallibly suffer by your temerity and precipitation. First of all, deliver your credentials at court, and let us join our endeavors to raise an interest strong enough to counterbalance that of Tobias. If we succeed, there will be no necessity for having recourse to personal measures. He will be compelled to yield up your inheritance which he unjustly detains, and to restore your sister to your arms, and if he afterwards refuses to do justice to the Countess, you will always have it in your power to evince yourself the son of the brave Count de Melville." These just and salutary representations had a due effect upon Rinaldo, who no sooner arrived at the capital of Austria, than he waited upon a certain prince of distinction, to whose patronage he was commended, and from whom he met with a very cordial reception, not only on account of his credentials, but also for the sake of his father, who was well known to his Highness. He heard his complaints with great patience and affability, assured him of his assistance and protection, and even undertook to introduce him to the Empress Queen, who would not suffer the weakest of her subjects to be oppressed, much less disregard the cause of an injured young nobleman, who, by his own services, and those of his family, was peculiarly entitled to her favor. Nor was he the only person whose countenance and patronage Melville solicited upon this occasion. He visited all the friends of his father, and all his mother's relations, who were easily interested in his behalf, while Major Farrell contributed all his efforts in strengthening the association. So that a lawsuit was immediately commenced against Count Tobias, who on his side was not idle, but prepared with incredible industry for the assault, resolving to maintain with his whole power the acquisition he had made. The laws of Hungary, like those of some other countries I could name, afford so many subterfuges for the purposes of perfidy and fraud, that it is no wonder our youth began to complain of the slow progress of his affair, especially as he glowed with the most eager desire of redressing the grievances of his parent and sister, whose sufferings he did not doubt were doubled since the institution of his process against their tormentor. He imparted his sentiments on this head to his friend, and, as his apprehensions every moment increased, plainly told him he could no longer live without making some effort to see those with whom he was so nearly connected in point of blood and affection. He therefore resolved to repair immediately to Pressburg, and, according to the intelligence he should procure, essay to see and converse with his mother, though at the hazard of his life. Chapter 58. Rinaldo abridges the proceedings at law, and approves himself the son of his father. The major, finding him determined, insisted upon attending him in this expedition, and they set out together for Pressburg, where they privately arrived in the dark, resolving to keep themselves concealed at the house of a friend, until they should have formed some plan for their future operations. Here they were informed that Count Trebesi's castle was altogether inaccessible, that all the servants who were supposed to have the least veneration or compassion for the countess were dismissed, and that, since Rinaldo was known to be in Germany, the vigilance and caution of that cruel husband was redoubled to such a degree, that nobody knew whether his unfortunate lady was actually alive or dead. Farrell, perceiving Melville exceedingly affected with this intimation, and hearing him declare that he would never quit Pressburg until he should have entered the house, and removed his doubts on that interesting subject, not only argued with great vehemence against such an attempt, as equally dangerous and indiscreet, but solemnly swore he would prevent his purpose, by discovering his design to the family, unless he would promise to listen to a more moderate and feasible expedient. He then proposed that he himself should appear in the equipage of one of the traveling Savoyards who stroll about Europe, amusing ignorant people with the effects of a magic lantern, and in that disguise endeavor to obtain admittance from the servants of Trebesi, among whom he might make such inquiries as would deliver Melville from his present uneasy suspense. This proposal was embraced, though reluctantly, by Rinaldo, who was unwilling to expose his friend to the least danger or disgrace, and the major being next day provided with the habit and implements of his new profession, together with a ragged attendant who preceded him, extorting music from a paltry viol, approached the castle gate, and proclaimed his show so naturally in a yell, partaking of the scream of Savoy and the howl of Ireland, that one would have imagined he had been conductor to Madame Katharina from his cradle. So far his stratagem succeeded. He had not long stood in waiting before he was invited into the courtyard, where the servants formed a ring, and danced to the efforts of his companion's skill. Then he was conducted into the buttery, where he exhibited his figures on the wall, and his princess on the floor, and while they regaled him in this manner with scraps and sour wine, he took occasion to inquire about the old lady and her daughter, before whom he said he had performed in his last peregrination. Though this question was asked with all that air of simplicity which is peculiar to these people, one of the domestics took the alarm, being infected with the suspicions of his master, and plainly taxed the major with being a spy, threatening at the same time that he should be stripped and searched. This would have been a very dangerous experiment for the Hibernian, who had actually in his pocket a letter to the countess from her son, which he hoped fortune might have furnished him with an opportunity to deliver. When he therefore found himself in this dilemma, he was not at all easy in his own mind. However, instead of protesting his innocence in an humble and beseeching strain, in order to acquit himself of the charge, he resolved to elude the suspicion by provoking the wrath of his accuser, and, putting on the air of vulgar integrity affronted, began to reproach the servant in very insolent terms for his unfair supposition, and undressed himself in a moment to the skin, threw his tattered garments in the face of his adversary, telling him he would find nothing there which he would not be very glad to part with. At the same time raising his voice, he, in the gibberish of the clan he represented, scolded and cursed with great fluency, so that the whole house resounded with the noise. The valet's jealousy, like a smaller fire, was in a trice swallowed up in the greater flame of his rage enkindled by this abrupt address. In consequence of which, Farrell was kicked out at the gate, naked as he was to the waist, after his lantern had been broke to pieces on his head, and there he was joined by his domestic, who had not been able to recover his apparel and effect a retreat, without incurring marks of the same sort of distinction. The major, considering the risk he must have run in being detected, thought himself cheaply quit for this moderate discipline, though he was really concerned for his friend Rinaldo, who, understanding the particulars of the adventure, determined, as the last effort, to ride round the castle in the open day, on pretence of taking the air, when, peradventure, the Countess would see him from the place of her confinement, and favour him with some mark or token of her being alive. Though his companion did not much relish this plan, which he foresaw would expose him to the insults of Tobias, yet, as he could not contrive a better, he acquiesced in Rinaldo's invention, with the proviso that he would defer the execution of it until his father-in-law should be absent in the chase, which was a diversion he every day enjoyed. Accordingly they set a proper watch, and lay concealed until they were informed of Tobias having gone forth, when they mounted their horses, and rode into the neighbourhood of the castle. Having made a small excursion in the adjoining fields, they drew nearer the walls, and at an easy pace had twice circled them, when Farrell descried, at the top of a tower, a white handkerchief waved by a woman's hand through the iron bars that secured the window. This signal being pointed out to Rinaldo, his heart began to throb with great violence. He made a respectful obeisance towards the part in which it appeared, and perceiving the hand beckoning him to approach, advanced to the very buttress of the turret, upon which, seeing something drop, he alighted with great expedition, and took up a picture of his father in miniature, the features of which he no sooner distinguished, than the tears ran down his cheeks. He pressed the little image to his lips with the most filial fervour, then conveying it to his bosom, looked up to the hand, which waved in such a manner as gave him to understand it was high time to retire. Being by this time highly persuaded that his kind monitor was no other than the Countess herself, he pointed to his heart, in token of his filial affection, and laying his hand on his sword, to denote his resolution of doing her justice, he took his leave with another profound bow, and suffered himself to be reconducted to his lodging. Every circumstance of this transaction was observed by the servants of Count Tobias, who immediately dispatched a messenger to their lord, with an account of what had happened. Alarmed at this information, from which he immediately concluded that the stranger was young Melville, he forthwith quitted the chase, and returning to the castle by a private postern, ordered his horse to be kept ready saddled, in hope that his son-in-law would repeat the visit to his mother. This precaution would have been to no purpose, had Rinaldo followed the advice of Farrell, who represented the danger of returning to a place where the alarm was undoubtedly given by his first appearance, and exhorted him to return to Vienna for the prosecution of his suit, now that he was satisfied of his mother's being alive. In order to strengthen this admonition, he bade him recollect the signal for withdrawing, which was doubtless the effect of maternal concern, inspired by the knowledge of the Count's vigilance and vindictive disposition. Notwithstanding these suggestions, Melville persisted in his resolution of appearing once more below the tower, on the supposition that his mother, in expectation of his return, had prepared a billet for his acceptance, from which he might obtain important intelligence. The Major, seeing him lend a deaf ear to his remonstrances, was contented to attend him in his second expedition, which he pressed him to undertake that same afternoon, as Tobias had taken care to circulate a report of his having gone to dine at the seat of a nobleman in the neighbourhood. Our knight-errant and his squire, deceived by this finesse, presented themselves again under the prison of the Countess, who no sooner beheld her son return, than she earnestly entreated him to be gone, by the same sign which she had before used, and he, taking it for granted that she was debarred the use of pen, ink, and paper, and that she had nothing more to expect, consented to retire, and had already moved to some distance from the house, when, in crossing a small plantation that belonged to the castle, they were met by Count Tobias and another person on horseback. At sight of this apparition, the blood mounted into Rinaldo's cheeks, and his eyes began to lighten with eagerness and indignation, which was not at all diminished by the ferocious address of the Count, who advancing to Melville, with a menacing air. "Before you proceed," said he, "I must know with what view you have been twice today patrolling round my enclosures, and reconnoitring the different avenues of my house. You likewise carry on a clandestine correspondence with some person in the family, of which my honor obliges me to demand an explanation." "Had your actions been always regulated by the dictates of honor," replied Rinaldo, "I should never have been questioned for riding round that castle, which you know is my rightful inheritance, or excluded from the sight of a parent who suffers under your tyranny and oppression. It is my part, therefore, to expostulate, and, since fortune hath favored me with an opportunity of revenging our wrongs in person, we shall not part until you have learned that the family of the Count de Melville is not to be injured with impunity. Here is no advantage on either side, in point of arms or number, you are better mounted than I am, and shall have the choice of the ground on which our difference ought to be brought to a speedy determination. Tobias, whose courage was not of the sentimental kind, but purely owing to his natural insensibility of danger, instead of concerting measures coolly for the engagement, or making any verbal reply to this defiance, drew a pistol, without the least hesitation, and fired it at the face of Rinaldo, part of whose left eyebrow was carried off by the ball. Melville was not slow in returning the compliment, which, as it was deliberate, proved the more decisive. For the shot entering the Count's right breast, made its way to the backbone with such a shock, as struck him to the ground, upon which the other alighted, in order to improve the advantage he had gained. During this transaction, Farrell had well nigh lost his life by the savage behavior of Tobias's attendant, who had been a hussar officer, and who, thinking it was his duty to imitate the example of his patron on this occasion, discharged a pistol at the major, before he had the least intimation of his design. The Hibernian's horse being a common hireling, and unaccustomed to stand fire, no sooner saw the flash of Tobias's pistol, than, starting aside, he happened to plunge into a hole, and was overturned at the very instant when the hussar's piece went off, so that no damage ensued to his rider, who, pitching on his feet, flew with great nimbleness to his adversary, then, laying hold on one leg, dismounted him in a twinkling, and, seizing his throat as he lay, would have soon dispatched him without the use of firearms, had he not been prevented by his friend Rinaldo, who desired him to desist, observing that his vengeance was already satisfied, as the Count seemed to be in the agonies of death. Chapter 59. He is the messenger of happiness to his sister, who removes the film which had long obstructed his penetration, with regard to Count Fathom. As the most endearing affection had always subsisted between Rinaldo and his sister, he would not one moment deny himself the pleasure of flying to her embrace, and of being the glad messenger of her deliverance. Soon, therefore, as he understood the place of her retreat, and had obtained a proper order to the abbess, signed by Count Tobias, he set out post for Vienna, still accompanied by his faithful Hibernian, and, arriving at the convent, found the abbess and the whole house so engrossed in making preparations for the ceremony of giving the veil next day to a young woman who had fulfilled the term of her probation, that he could not possibly see his sister with that leisure and satisfaction which he had flattered himself with enjoying at this meeting, and therefore he was fain to bridle his impatience for 2 days, and keep his credentials until the hurry should be over, that mademoiselle might have no intimation of her good fortune, except from his own mouth. In order to fill up this tedious interval, he visited his friends at court, who were rejoiced to hear the happy issue of his excursion to Pressburg. The prince, who was his particular patron, desired he would make himself perfectly easy with regard to the death of Count Tobias, for he would take care to represent him in such a light to the Empress Queen, as would screen him from any danger or prosecution on that account. His Highness, moreover, appointed the following day for performing the promise he had made of presenting him to that august princess, and in the meantime prepossessed her so much in his favor, that when he approached her presence, and was announced by his noble introductor, she eyed him with a look of peculiar complacency, saying, "I am glad to see you return to my dominions. Your father was a gallant officer, who served our house with equal courage and fidelity, and as I understand you tread in his footsteps, you may depend upon my favor and protection." He was so much overwhelmed with this gracious reception, that, while he bowed in silence, the drops of gratitude trickled from his eyes, and her imperial majesty was so well pleased with this manifestation of his heart, that she immediately gave directions for promoting him to the command of a troop of horse. Thus fortune seemed willing, and indeed eager to discharge the debt she owed him for the different calamities he had undergone. And as he looked upon the generous Hebrew to be the sole source of his success, he did not fail to make him acquainted with the happy effects of his recommendation and friendship, and to express, in the warmest terms, the deep sense he had of his uncommon benevolence, which, by the by, was still greater, with regard to Rinaldo, than the reader as yet imagines, for he not only furnished him with money for his present occasions, but also gave him an unlimited credit on a banker in Vienna, to whom one of his letters was directed. The ceremony of the nun's admission being now performed, and the convent restored to its former quiet, Melville hastened thither on the wings of brotherly affection, and presented his letter to the abbess, who having perused the contents, by which she learned that the family disquiets of Count Trebesi no longer subsisted, and that the bearer was the brother of Mademoiselle, she received him with great politeness, congratulated him on this happy event, and, begging he would excuse her staying with him in the parlor, on pretence of business, withdrew, saying, she would immediately send in a young lady who would console him for her absence. In a few minutes he was joined by his sister, who, expecting nothing less than to see Rinaldo, no sooner distinguished his features, than she shrieked aloud with surprise, and would have sunk upon the floor, had not he supported her in his embrace. Such a sudden apparition of her brother at any time, or in any place, after their long separation, would have strongly affected this sensible young lady, but to find him so abruptly in a place where she thought herself buried from the knowledge of all her relations, occasioned such commotions in her spirits as had well nigh endangered her reason. For it was not till after a considerable pause, that she could talk to him with connection or coherence. However, as those transports subsided, they entered into a more deliberate and agreeable conversation, in the course of which, he gradually informed her of what had passed at the castle, and inexpressible was the pleasure she felt in learning that her mother was released from captivity, herself restored to freedom, and her brother to the possession of his inheritance, by the only means to which she had always prayed these blessings might be owing. As she had been treated with uncommon humanity by the abbess, she would not consent to leave the convent until he should be ready to set out for Pressburg, so that they dined together with that good lady, and passed the afternoon in that mutual communication with which a brother and sister may be supposed to entertain themselves on such an occasion. She gave him a detail of the insults and mortifications she had suffered from the brutality of her father-in-law, and told him that her confinement in this monastery was owing to Trebesi having intercepted a letter to her from Rinaldo, signifying his intention to return to the empire, in order to assert his own right, and redress his grievances. Then turning the discourse upon the incidents of his peregrinations, she in a particular manner inquired about that exquisite beauty who had been the innocent source of all his distresses, and upon whose perfections he had often, in his letters to his sister, expatiated with indications of rapture and delight. This inquiry in a moment blew up that scorching flame which had been well-nigh stifled by other necessary avocations. His eyes gleamed, his cheeks glowed and grew pale alternately, and his whole frame underwent an immediate agitation, which being perceived by Mademoiselle, she concluded that some new calamity was annexed to the name of Monimia, and, dreading to rip up a wound which she saw was so ineffectually closed, she for the present suppressed her curiosity and concern, and industriously endeavored to introduce some less affecting subject of conversation. He saw her aim, approved of her discretion, and, joining her endeavors, expressed his surprise at her having omitted to signify the least remembrance of her old favorite, Fathom, whom he had left in England. He had no sooner pronounced this name, than she suffered some confusion in her turn, from which, however, recollecting herself, "Brother," said she, "you must endeavor to forget that wretch, who is altogether unworthy of retaining the smallest share of your regard." Astonished, and indeed angry, at this expression, which he considered as the effect of malicious misrepresentation, he gently chid her for her credulity in believing the envious aspersion of some person, who repined at the superior virtue of Fathom, whom he affirmed to be an honor to the human species. "Nothing is more easy," replied the young lady, "than to impose upon a person, who, being himself unconscious of guile, suspects no deceit. You have been a dupe, dear brother, not to the finesse of Fathom, but to the sincerity of your own heart. For my own part, I assume no honor to my own penetration in having comprehended the villainy of that impostor, which was discovered, in more than one instance, by accidents I could not possibly foresee. You must know, that Teresa, who attended me from my childhood, and in whose honesty I reposed such confidence, having disobliged some of the inferior servants, was so narrowly watched in all her transactions, as to be at last detected in the very act of conveying a piece of plate, which was actually found concealed among her clothes. You may guess how much I was astonished when I understood this circumstance. I could not trust to the evidence of my own senses, and should have still believed her innocent, in spite of ocular demonstration, had not she, in the terrors of being tried for felony, promised to make a very material discovery to the Countess, provided she would take such measures as would save her life. This request being complied with, she, in my hearing, opened up such an amazing scene of iniquity, baseness, and ingratitude, which had been acted by her and Fathom, in order to defraud the family to which they were so much indebted, that I could not have believed the human mind capable of such degeneracy, or that traitor endowed with such pernicious cunning and dissimulation, had not her tale been congruous, consistent, and distinct, and fraught with circumstances that left no room to doubt the least article of her confession, on consideration of which she was permitted to go into voluntary exile. She then explained their combination in all the particulars, as we have already recounted them in their proper place, and finally observed, that the opinion she had hence conceived of Fathom's character, was confirmed by what she had since learned of his perfidious conduct towards that very nun who had lately taken the veil. Perceiving her brother struck dumb with astonishment, and gaping with the most eager attention, she proceeded to relate the incidents of his double intrigue with the jeweller's wife and daughter, as they were communicated to her by the nun, who was no other than the individual Wilhelmina. After those rivals had been forsaken by their gallant, their mutual animosities and chagrin served to whet the attention and invention of each, so that in a little time the whole mystery stood disclosed to both. The mother had discovered the daughter's correspondence with Fathom, as we have formerly observed, by means of that unfortunate letter which he unwittingly committed to the charge of the old beldame, and, as soon as she understood he was without the reach of all solicitation or prosecution, imparted this billet to her husband, whose fury was so ungovernable, that he had almost sacrificed Wilhelmina with his own hands, especially when, terrified by his threats and imprecations, she owned that she had bestowed the chain on this perfidious lover. However, this dreadful purpose was prevented, partly by the interposition of his wife, whose aim was not the death but immurement of his daughter, and partly by the tears and supplication of the young gentlewoman herself, who protested, that, although the ceremony of the church had not been performed, she was contracted to Fathom by the most solemn vows, to witness which he invoked all the saints in heaven. The jeweller, upon cooler consideration, was unwilling to lose the last spark of hope that glittered among the ruins of his despair, and resisted all the importunities of his wife, who pressed him to consult the welfare of his daughter's soul, in the fond expectation of finding some expedient to lure back the chain and its possessor. In the meantime Wilhelmina was daily and hourly exposed to the mortifying animadversions of her mamma, who, with all the insolence of virtue, incessantly upbraided her with the backslidings of her vicious life, and exhorted her to reformation and repentance. This continual triumph lasted for many months, till at length, a quarrel happening between the mother and the gossip at whose house she used to give the rendezvous to her admirers, that incensed confidante, in the precipitation of her anger, promulgated the history of those secret meetings, and, among the rest, her interviews with Fathom were brought to light. The first people who hear news of this sort are generally those to whom they are most unwelcome. The German was soon apprised of his wife's frailty, and considered the two females of his house as a couple of devils incarnate, sent from hell to exercise his patience. Yet, in the midst of his displeasure, he found matter of consolation, in being furnished with a sufficient reason for parting with his helpmate, who had for many years kept his family in disquiet. He therefore, without hazarding a personal conference, sent proposals to her by a friend, which she did not think proper to reject, and seeing himself restored to the dominion of his own house, exerted his sway so tyrannically, that Wilhelmina became weary of her life, and had recourse to the comforts of religion, of which she soon became enamored, and begged her father's permission to dedicate the rest of her life to the duties of devotion. She was accordingly received in this convent, the regulations of which were so much to her liking, that she performed the task of probation with pleasure, and voluntarily excluded herself from the vanities of this life. It was here she had contracted an acquaintance with Mademoiselle de Melville, to whom she communicated her complaints of Fathom, on the supposition that he was related to the Count, as he himself had often declared. While the young lady rehearsed the particulars of this detail, Rinaldo sustained a strange vicissitude of different passions. Surprise, sorrow, fear, hope, and indignation raised a most tumultuous conflict in his bosom. Monimia rushed upon his imagination in the character of innocence betrayed by the insinuations of treachery. He with horror viewed her at the mercy of a villain, who had broken all the ties of gratitude and honor. Affrighted at the prospect, he started from his seat, exclaiming, in the most unconnected strain of distraction and despair, "Have I then nourished a serpent in my bosom? Have I listened to the voice of a traitor, who hath murdered my peace? Who hath torn my heartstrings asunder, and perhaps ruined the pattern of all earthly perfection? It cannot be. Heaven would not suffer such infernal artifice to take effect. The thunder would be leveled against the head of the accursed projector." From this transport, compared with his agitation when he mentioned Monimia, his sister judged that Fathom had been the occasion of a breach between the two lovers, and this conjecture being confirmed by the disjointed answers he made to her interrogations upon the affair, she endeavored to calm his apprehensions, by representing that he would soon have an opportunity of returning to England, where the misunderstanding might be easily cleared up, and that, in the meantime, he had nothing to fear on account of the person of his mistress, in a country where individuals were so well protected by the laws and constitution of the realm. At length he suffered himself to be flattered with the fond hope of seeing Monimia's character triumph in the inquiry, of retrieving that lost jewel, and of renewing that ravishing intercourse and exalted expectation which had been so cruelly cut off. He now wished to find Fathom as black as he had been exhibited, that Monimia's apostasy might be numbered among the misrepresentations of his treachery and fraud. His love, which was alike generous and ardent, espoused the cause, and he no longer doubted her constancy and virtue. But when he reflected how her tender heart must have been wrung with anguish at his unkindness and cruelty, in leaving her destitute in a foreign land, how her sensibility must have been tortured in finding herself altogether dependent upon a ruffian, who certainly harbored the most baleful designs upon her honor, how her life must be endangered both by his barbarity and her own despair, I say, when he reflected on these circumstances, he shuddered with horror and dismay, and that very night dispatched a letter to his friend the Jew, entreating him, in the most pressing manner, to employ all his intelligence in learning the situation of the fair orphan, that she might be protected from the villainy of Fathom, until his return to England.